fourth graders, Miss Straits here, and today we're going to be taking a journey through the geological history of Illinois. So we're going to start way back a long time ago, actually 500 million years ago, and see how Illinois became what it is today. So if we go back in time, what would we see? What did Illinois look like 500 million years ago? Okay. First, we're going to be hopping into our time machine and take a little ride. We're going to start our adventure 500 million years ago, all the way down here in the Paleozoic era. This is the age of ancient life, and the only living creatures on Earth were in the ocean. So here we are in the Paleozoic era. So actually, Illinois would be a warm tropical ocean, okay? And the only life on Earth was found in the sea. So you would see things like this cephalopod here that had this long shell. You would see brachiopods, and you would see trilobites. So when Earth was just a shallow ocean, the only life was in the water, okay? So creatures like this cephalopod. So a cephalopod is almost like a modern day squid. It had this long straight shell, and then the soft tissue of the head came out this way. Okay, these are descendants of today's horseshoe crab. Okay. Some of these cephalopods, their shells actually curled up like this, and these are very common fossils that you can find in Illinois today that tell us about those oceans from so long ago. Trilobites were another animal that lived at this time. This is sort of a medium-sized trilobite, but some of them were as small, just like a centimeter long, and some of them got to be 2 feet long. Okay. Another common creature of the time was a brachiopod. So brachiopods actually look like little shells, but this nice chunk of limestone shows tons of brachiopod fossils. Again, this is how we knew that this ocean existed. When we dig down in the earth in Illinois, we find all these fossils that lived all this time ago, and we realize that it really was an ocean. Okay. So this is where Illinois was. It was actually near the equator. I know that's hard to understand, but back then, this is what the Earth looked like. All our continents were actually grouped together into one big, huge supercontinent called Pangaea. Okay, so this is how that happened. So if we're looking down below the crust of the Earth where we live, so we live on this really thin layer here called the crust. Just below the crust is this big, thick mantle layer. And this mantle layer is rock that's so hot that it's actually a thick liquid, kind of like molasses or a really thick syrup. And it's very hot, okay? And here we are, we're kind of floating on top of that on this little thin crust, okay? So everything alive on Earth is actually living on top of this crust here. Now this crust is broken into pieces, just like a puzzle. They fit together like this, okay? These are all the plates, we call them. So they're pieces that fit together like a puzzle, and we call them plates, tectonic plates, okay? And they make up the whole crust of our Earth. All right, so let's look back at this picture again. All right, so we're going to look at this hot, bubbly layer. All right, so it's kind of like water when it's bubbling on the stove. You see how the water starts bubbling, the bubbles come up from the bottom, they rise to the top and they pop, and then they go back down again. Well, this is happening underneath the Earth too. We've got this heat, okay, which creates a lot of pressure on that crust, okay? And remember that crust is broken into pieces. So when we create a lot of pressure on those crust pieces, okay, lots of different things start to happen. Sometimes those pieces bump into each other. Sometimes those pieces spread apart. Sometimes those pieces rub into each other this way. And that's what creates some of the landforms that we see on Earth. All right, so I'm going to show you this quick little video here. I'm just going to show you a little part of it. So this is actually ice that has formed on the surface of a lake. Okay, and the reason I'm showing you this is because the way the ice is cracked and how it's moving against the different pieces is a little bit like how Earth behaves. So when these pieces push up against each other, notice there's a little pile there. So they've actually created little mountains where those pieces have jutted against each other. Where the pieces spread out, okay, it actually drops down into the water. But think about what's underneath our crust isn't water, it's molten lava, actually. Okay, and sometimes it does come up through the surface between those plates. So I just want you to keep this in mind as we're moving along here. You're going to learn more about this in 5th grade. So you don't need to understand it too much, but just so that you get the idea that our Earth has a crust on it that's broken into these pieces, and those pieces are moving around. Okay. And as those pieces move, they create all sorts of things like earthquakes, they create mountains, they create new seafloor when they spread apart. Okay, so all sorts of interesting things are happening beneath the surface. So Illinois changes quite drastically from the beginning of our journey to the end of our journey. Okay, so during our history of Illinois, okay, we didn't stay at tropical ocean, obviously, because now we live in Illinois and there's no tropical ocean here. So at some point, some of that mantle underneath caused some shifting in the plate where Illinois was, okay? And these mountains formed over here in the east, okay? In the northern part of Illinois, part of the land actually cracked and kind of folded. So some of that ocean that was down there has kind of been lifted up to the surface. In southern Illinois, part of the land actually sunk a little bit. So all these things that take millions of years, over time, these things are shifting and changing. And obviously Illinois also as a whole state moved further north because we're no longer living near the equator. So we're just going to keep these things in mind, that Earth is constantly shifting and that Illinois at one time was all the way down near the equator. It was really warm and was actual ocean, a nice shallow ocean. Okay. So now let's think about, we had this tropical ocean here, remember? And then these mountains started to build up over here in the east. Okay. Well, what happens when you have mountains? When it rains, okay, and also up in mountains, sometimes you have snow and ice that melts, and that water has to go somewhere. So it runs downhill. Well, when water runs downhill, it doesn't just take the water with it, it also takes debris with it. And that debris travels down and actually settled into that tropical ocean and filled it up. So at one point, we just learned that Illinois was actually a nice, shallow, tropical ocean. Okay. But eventually, we had some mountains that formed over in the eastern part of Illinois. And with those mountains, we have that elevation. And when it's raining, that water is washing downhill and actually carrying a lot of debris. So rocks, sand, gravel, downstream, and it fills in. This is called a delta. Okay, so a delta is an area where a lot of wash sort of spreads out. And this is what happened to those shallow oceans. They actually got filled in with all this outwash, and it filled up to the point where there was just a little bit of water left, and it created this nice kind of spongy land that became a swamp area where all these beautiful tall trees formed. And that's when the animals actually moved from the sea up onto land. Right? Once those tropical oceans got buried underneath some of that sediment, okay, that sand, okay, that thick layer of sand became sandstone. That pressure actually turned the sand into rock. Okay. A lot of times we find fossils in sandstone, like this trilobite right here. Sometimes the seashells crush and other deposits get in there. And again, that pressure pushes down on it and it becomes limestone. And this limestone can have lots of fossils in it as well. This is a crinoid. Okay. And a crinoid was like an ancient plant. Kind of think about if you go into the tropics and you swim down in the ocean, you see these plants. Okay. These were the plants that lived in that tropical ocean 500 million years ago. All right, now we're going to be moving forward in time. We're going to move in our time machine to 325 million years ago. Now the tropical oceans have filled up with silt and we're moving forward in time all the way up here. We're still in the Paleozoic era, but now we are in the age of amphibians, about 325 million years ago when the coal forests were first formed. So we started down here, all the way down here at the bottom. We've moved up here, okay? So now, remember, our tropical ocean is no longer there. It's been filled up with sediment, okay? So now there's just a really thin layer of water. So it's created sort of this wetland, so this swampy area. So for the first time, animals start moving onto land. Remember, back when it was a tropical ocean, there were no animals living on land. Okay, there were only animals living in the sea. But now we've moved where we have some plants growing on land. So this is the first time there were ever forests in our Earth, on our entire planet Earth. Okay, so we finally have some plants here 325 million years ago. So we've moved forward in time, but we're still way back in time. All right. So these are some of the creatures that lived there. This was the age of amphibians. So now we have these creatures that have kind of moved from the water. So think of a frog's an amphibian. And the frog starts life in the water and moves onto land when it gets legs. So in this period in time, we're kind of thinking about, so we went from this ocean life and we moved a few million years ahead of time. And now some of those creatures have evolved into creatures that live on the land. So amphibians were some of those first creatures that became land dwellers. Okay. And some of these amphibians were 10 feet long. They had very sharp teeth. There were dragonflies that were as big as hawks. So think about a hawk actually has a wingspan not much smaller than my arms. So think of a dragonfly that's as big as your arms and your wingspan. Giant cockroaches. Cockroaches are one of the few things that are alive today that were living way back then because they're so adaptable and able to move from one environment to another. So we still have some fossils that show those cockroaches. Okay. So we have these thick forests full of trees that eventually start to get buried. Okay. Remember we have that mountain up here. Okay. And you have large amounts of water that flow down that mountain. Okay, and as they're flowing down that mountain, they're taking all that sediment with them. So this is a picture of a delta. Okay, and all those great forests got covered by this delta. So all those trees got covered. So you've got this silt and sand and deposits that are building up on top of your forests. Okay. So this is kind of what happened to those forests. So here we have, just ignore these dinosaurs here. Just they're not around yet. They haven't lived yet. We're not to the dinosaurs, but this was a good picture. So here's our forests. Our forests get buried underneath the ground. All this sediment gets pushed on top of it. And that pressure of all that sediment on top of that organic matter, that those trees and the leaves actually gets pressed down and they get turned into coal. And now we know this happened because here in Illinois, we have coal mines. At least we used to mine coal in Illinois, not so much anymore. But there's even a city called Coal City, and it's right here. Okay? And it was named after the mines that were prevalent there at the time. Okay. So this takes millions of years for that coal to form. Okay. That's why we call them fossil fuels. Coal, natural gases. These are things that we as humans dig up out of the ground that formed down underneath the surface millions of years ago. We dig them up and we use it for fuel. Okay. Um, and so the coal was one of the first industries that we had here in this area of the world. Okay, now we're getting back into our time machine and we're going to move forward again to about 290 million years ago. Now that the forests have been covered with debris, we're moving up into the Mesozoic era. This is when dinosaurs first make their appearance in the age of reptiles. So we're about 290 million years ago. And now we are in the dinosaur age. Okay. So yes, there were dinosaurs in Illinois. Okay. This was also a period of time when the first flowers appeared. So remember, we were in the swamps. Now those swamps have been covered by deposits. So now Illinois is kind of hilly. It's got hills, valleys. It's warm. It's dry. We've got these first birds that have teeth. We've got flying reptiles. These are the things that are living here in Illinois at this time during the Mesozoic era. Okay. Now, no one really knows for sure what happened to those dinosaurs and those plants that lived at that time. Okay. Two different possibilities. One was a meteor that fell through our Earth's atmosphere and crashed into Earth. And when that happened, it blocks out the sun. Okay. And once that sun is gone, the animals and plants that live there, okay, it gets too cold and they cannot survive. So another thought is that there was just a basic shift in the climate, okay, and it got too cold and those animals couldn't survive anymore. Interestingly enough, there is evidence that a meteor hit right here in Illinois in Des Plaines, which is only 10 minutes away from here. So interesting little fact about your neighborhood. Okay, so they're saying there's dinosaurs here. Where are the fossils? Well, here's what happened. So we've got wind, we've got water. We know that water is great at carrying things away. Wind does the same thing. Okay, this is called erosion. It erodes away at the land. So you guys know, just like when you're at the beach and you pour a bucket of water on a pile of sand, what happens to that sand? It kind of gets washed away. Okay, well, when animals were dying, okay, because of that meteor, because of that climate change, unfortunately, they didn't have things that piled up on top of them and kept them preserved as fossils. That wind, that water, it washed those fossils away. It washed that topsoil away so that they didn't get buried and turned into fossils. So the conditions just weren't right at that time in history for those dinosaur fossils to be preserved. Okay. A lot of times in drier climates, where bones and dead animals maybe, or in riverbeds where those animals get buried really quickly, they get preserved. But in Illinois' case, those dinosaurs did not get preserved. And so we don't have any fossils today other than plants, fossils of plants and ocean creatures that lived a long time ago. Okay, now we're moving forward into the Cenozoic era. Now we're going to move to the end of the Cenozoic era. Now we're in the ice ages where we're going to see lots of glacier activity. Okay. Now we're going to move to the end of the Cenozoic era. Okay. And strangely enough, if we looked at where Illinois was at the time, the Mississippi River, okay, that we know of today, all the way over here in the western part of Illinois, it was going through the middle of Illinois. Okay, so what happened? This is a nice landmark that we can kind of investigate. So we're going to move forward in time and see if we can figure this out. Okay. So about 2 million years ago, we had the beginning of the Ice Age. Okay. So there's a couple of things that we need to understand about the Ice Age and what that really means. So the first thing is glaciers. So glaciers are this ice and snow that gets compounded and gets stacked up, and it forms these huge moving, almost living, breathing mounds of ice that move forward and backwards through time. Okay. As they move, they grind and they scraped. And I'm going to show you a little video of that in just a minute. They scrape away the earth. Okay. When the ice melts, it leaves all that stuff that it scraped, it leaves it behind. These are called moraines. They're like little hills and piles of sand and particles from mountains and jagged rocky edges that got ground over by the glacier. Okay. Then when those glaciers start to melt, all that water has to go somewhere. Okay. So it washes down and it takes a lot of that sediment with it. Okay. And it does all sorts of interesting things to the land.
Okay, so we're going to talk about glaciers just for a few minutes here. During the glacial age, Illinois was shaped by the movement of the back and forth of the glaciers. So first of all, let's talk about what a glacier is. A glacier is just a pile of ice. So basically when snow falls, it falls and makes layer after layer, which is pushing down because of the weight of the snow. It gets so high that the pressure pushes down and turns it into a block of ice. Okay? This block of ice lasts for millions of years. So think about sort of a rocky landscape, which was northern Illinois at one time. This glacier came down and actually scraped across the land like that. It's moving very slowly, but over time, it's pushing the rocks and grinding them up. So think of something really hard, really heavy, scraping over these rocks, and it turns it into gravel and then into sand. So as the ice is moving, it's carrying that gravel or that sand along with it. Then the ice would melt and the glaciers would move back again. Okay. And then they'd move forward again as they grew. And they actually created these hills called moraines. So these hills are mounds of basically glacial debris. So debris is just sort of stuff that's left behind. And when we're talking about glaciers, that debris, we call it till. Okay, that's just a fancy word for the debris that's left behind. And that till creates these nice rolling hills that we see today up in northern Illinois. The last thing is, as water from the glaciers melting, okay, washes some of that debris out like this, it creates what we call an outwash. So the outwash is that debris that then is sort of washed downhill from the melting of the glaciers. And those are just some things just about glaciers in general and the different parts of a glacier.
Now we're entering into this age of mammals. So before this, there weren't any mammals. Okay, we had those reptiles, we had those flying birds, we had the dinosaurs, but now we're getting into some of those mammals that look similar to some mammals we have today. Okay, so during this ice age, we had these huge blocks of ice that would move forward, and then it would get a little warmer and they'd move back, they'd move forward, they move back. Okay, so during the warmer times, we had some animals like this giant jaguar, the armadillo, these kind of crazy looking pig things. Okay, then in the colder weather, okay, we had some sort of the mastodon, which is sort of like the present day elephant, giant beaver, if you can imagine. Actual beaver would be this big, but the beavers then were like really big. These stag moose. Okay, so lots of different types of animals living during this ice age. Okay, and what did the glaciers do to Illinois? Okay, this is what we're going to be investigating next. And we're going to get back to that Mississippi River. Okay. First, I'm going to show you a quick little video of what actually happened to the Mississippi River.
So at one point, the Mississippi River actually went through the middle of Illinois, like you see on the map in the slideshow. But at some point, all that outwash from the glaciers started to fill in this area with all the till that was washing down, and the river started changing direction and finding a new route down the west side of Illinois. So you can see as that till starts filling in where the river was, the river finds a new direction. Water's always going to go to the lowest point. So as that till starts filling in, the river finds a new route all the way over on the western side of Illinois. And that's where it is today.
Okay, let's review what the glaciers did to Illinois. So we have rushing water that flooded and carved out what's now Starved Rock. If you've ever been there hiking, there's beautiful canyons and waterfalls. With the warmer weather, most of the larger animals died out or were hunted by humans. Okay, so those woolly mammoths were no longer. Warmer weather caused oak woodlands and prairies and the thick, rich soil from the blowing silt. So remember, we talked about the wind blowing that topsoil. So when that soil then settles down, it makes a nice, rich base for plant life to grow. It also was evened out the land so it was nice and flat.
So one of the things that wind erosion did for Illinois is it took some of the deposits from up in the mountains and it blew the top, which was sort of like gravel and sand and clay mixed together, and it blew it downhill into some areas that created these nice flat lands where beautiful prairies were created. So when the vegetation grew on that nice rich soil that came down from the outwash, it created these nice flat areas that turned into some of our Illinois prairies.
Okay, and moving on. Strong winds blew across the outwash, making piles of sand dunes that are now covered by vegetation. So if you've ever been to Indiana or Michigan, you know there's beautiful sand dunes. In Illinois, most of those sand dunes ended up getting covered up. Some of that is now the city of Chicago that was built right on top of that pile of sand. The moraines blocked water and created lakes, and these areas are now very flat parts of Illinois. So there's lots of farming in Illinois where the land is flat. Nice, rich soil. Okay. And I bet you're wondering about those Great Lakes that we have. So we have Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Superior, Lake Erie. So those lakes were actually formed by those glaciers. So I want you to think about glaciers that are as tall as the Willis Tower, and then think about all that water melting. So that filled in some of those areas that then had been scraped out by the glaciers. So those glaciers scraped and carved out much of the Illinois' rocky landscape. Okay, so it's digging and actually scraping the surface of the land. Well, the softer rock underneath, like that sandstone and limestone, is going to scrape a lot easier. So it's going to make deeper grooves where the harder rocks are going to remain. Okay, so when the glaciers melted, they filled in all those dips. And if we look at this picture here, this is Glencoe Beach, if you've ever been up a little bit further north from Glenview. Okay, all along there, Winnetka and Kenilworth has this nice big hill right next to the water. And what they think is that's actually the edge of a moraine. So remember, those moraines were those big deposits of debris that was left by the glaciers. So if you had this big pile, okay, that sort of made a wall around those lower areas, where the water was filling up from the glaciers. And that is the end. However, we still have this really important question. How do we know so much about the history of Illinois if humans weren't around to see it? So think about what you learned last year in third grade, okay, about the fossils and things that give us hints about what happened in the past. So some of our evidence of Illinois history. Remember, we have this limestone that's down at the very bottom layer from our tropical oceans. We've got this shale layer right here that was made from the seashells and the sand that was crushed and pressed down, right? We've got those tropical, the swamps that were then added another layer. Okay, so all of that evidence gives us the ideas that we have today. And we go back and we look at these things, scientists, geologists, okay, they go back and they look at all this data and they figure out Illinois' history based on the things that they've left behind. We have all those fossils of early creatures. So we know there had to be an ocean because of the fossils that were found there. Even the leaf fossils tell us what kind of plants were growing there at the time. Okay, so all this is really important for us to kind of turn back time and figure out what happened before we were here. Okay, so I want you to make sure you've completely filled out your worksheet today because you're going to be needing that for your Create this week. All right, guys, have a great day.